In this video, we're going to talk about Ecology Lecture 8, where we discussed primary succession versus secondary succession. And you need to know the differences between those two, okay? Starting with this picture right here, you need to kind of remember this picture, but you might see one of these pictures on the test as well. But you have to know how to break this down even without these labels. So let's first take a look at the primary succession, which is right here. For primary succession, we always start with bare rock or some sort of, I don't know, concrete or volcanic eruption residue. But either way, there is no soil. The major difference between primary and secondary succession is that primary succession is a complete new beginning of life where there is not even soil and there's no seeds or roots or anything. We start brand new. The next step, we have our pioneer species. Those are the species that first occupy an area after a succession. Oh wait, let's go back. What is a succession? So a succession is kind of when you have a natural disaster and the whole ecosystem gets destroyed, how this ecosystem get rebuilt is the process of succession. So pioneer species is the first species that come into an area after a succession. In the case of primary succession, when we start on bare rock, right? If there's no soil, a lot of plants cannot grow and animals cannot live at a place without plants because there wouldn't be any producers. But there are lichens. So lichens are kind of the little green organism, photosynthetic organism that live on trees. So there's lichens and mosses that come in as the pioneer species. They're the pioneers. They're first coming in and making this area more and more livable. So as these lichens living there and dying and breaking down, they are producing more nutrients for the area. And as the wind blows and the lichens breaking down some of the rocks as well, eventually we'll have a little bit of soil, and that soil allows some small plants to live. And then after that, we have then we can have some grasses, right? The birds and animals, as they're coming into this area, they can drop seeds, and the seeds can only live after the soil gets reformed from our very beginning of the bare rock. So at this point, we can have grasses and some small bushes, and then we get slightly bigger bushes, and eventually, so that's our intermediate species. That's when we go from pioneer species to the climax community. So eventually we get to the climax community, which is a community where, not to say the whole environment is stable, but in general, everything kind of calms down and we have plenty of organisms living there. We have some tall trees living in this area. So this is the process of the primary succession. And then, so take a second to look over this picture. Again, see the transition going from bare rock to our pioneer species, to having some soil and small grass, some small bushes, to eventually our climax community, where everything is good. Then the next one is our secondary succession. Secondary succession could happen after a forest fire, for example. But the key here is that a secondary succession starts with an area that already has soil. So this is more of a new area, a new habitat for organisms, but this one is an old place. This place used to have a lot of plants and animals, but because for example, forest fire, all the plants and animals are gone. The result of that is there is still soil at the beginning of secondary succession, and there could even be some seeds and roots living beneath the ground. You just can't see them. So our pioneer species for secondary succession are whatever grows from the seeds and the roots. Most of the time there's some small plants and grasses, and then we have our intermediate species. Eventually we get to our climax community. So if you look at this, right, it takes a while. This whole rebuild process takes a while. Primary succession in general takes way longer because it takes a long time just to get the rocks into soil. And it didn't start with seeds and roots already in the soil because there was no soil. So primary succession takes way longer, and secondary succession doesn't take as long. So let's take a look at the questions. What is an ecological succession? Is the process of an area being destroyed and or starting a rebuild process of an ecosystem. Primary and secondary succession, some comparisons. Primary succession has soil, secondary does not. What causes it? Primary succession is a volcanic eruption is a good enough example. What is the secondary succession? It has soil. What causes it? Usually a forest fire or a hurricane, some sort of ecological event that destroys an area that used to have living organisms. Which type of succession typically completes faster? That will be your secondary succession. It reaches the climax community a lot faster. There's a comparison chart. I'll show you that right now. There's a comparison chart on our PowerPoint, which is right here. Take a look at this. It talks about our pioneer species are different. The biomass is different. The area, one is new, one is old, and the soil, and whether there was life at the beginning of the succession. So this is a good chart for you to remember. But again, please don't memorize a lot of these ideas. Obviously, you need to remember or memorize what ecological succession is. But once you understand primary and secondary, one has soil, primary has soil, and secondary does not, after that, there's just a lot of reasoning, right? It makes sense that primary succession takes longer because we didn't have any soil. And then the next one is soil building is the dominant characteristics of ecological succession, because in order for our ecosystem to move on and get rebuilt, we need the soil. The next one is pioneer species. What are they? They're the first organisms that come into an area or live in an area after an ecological succession. Examples. For primary succession, the pioneer species are the mosses and lichens. And then for secondary succession, we have roots and seeds that's already in the soil, or some small grasses. Climax community is when the ecosystem reaches a more stable state. So if you look right here, it's a mature, relatively stable ecosystem. When is it produced or restored? It's at the end of the succession. It takes a while. Examples of climax community, a forest, for example, it takes a while to get to that point where there are a lot of plants and animals and they're all living happily ever after. And then are climax communities uniform? That means are in a climax community, for example, if you have a forest, are all parts of the forest the same? The answer is no, right? And then the next one is an ecosystem might not recover from which type of disturbance is the human disturbance. Of course, we're ruining everything. The reason for that is we could destroy a place so much that the ecosystem will just take way too long to recover. And one thing I forgot to mention in the biome video is because the biome is characterized, and this is way off topic, but since I forgot to mention in the other video, biomes are characterized by their biotic and abiotic factors, and the abiotic factors are mostly temperature and precipitation, right? So you should know that each biome are very similar in the ways that their abiotic factors are very similar, but they don't have the exact same species either. No two places have the same exact species, right? Not even two households has the same number of dogs or even have dogs at all. So it makes sense. Not a single place is exactly the same on Earth. Okay, so this is ecology number 8. Move on to ecology number 9.